The dark system behind Nazi birth control. Good evening, dear friends. In every society, the act of bringing a child into the world is meant to symbolize continuity, hope, and renewal. But in 1930s Germany, even this most intimate human act was quietly transformed into an instrument of state power. Behind public parades, uniforms, and promises of national rebirth, a hidden system took shape, one that sought to manage who could be born, who would be valued, and who would simply disappear from history. It was presented as care, it was framed as protection, and it was justified as science. Tonight's story is not about battlefields or speeches. It is about how authority entered the private spaces of life, families, identities, and futures, and rewrote them according to ideology. This is the story of how a regime attempted to engineer its tomorrow, not through persuasion alone, but through control over birth itself. And what happens when human life is reduced to a policy? This belief drew from early 20th century ideas that claimed societies could be improved through selective reproduction. While such theories circulated in many countries at the time, Nazi Germany transformed them into governing doctrine. The state would no longer merely rule over people. It would decide which lives were valuable enough to continue. At the center of this vision stood Heinrich Himmler, who viewed population planning as a strategic necessity. In the mid-1930s, under his direction, a program was created that appeared, on the surface, to support mothers and children. It was presented as modern, compassionate, and scientific. In reality, it was a tightly controlled system designed to expand what the regime defined as a racially ideal population. Special maternity facilities were established under direct SS supervision. They were discreet, well-funded, and deliberately separated from ordinary social services. Admission was not based on hardship or need, but on ancestry, physical appearance, and perceived health. Women who met these criteria were encouraged and sometimes quietly pressured to give birth within these institutions. Inside, conditions were intentionally superior to those experienced by most civilians. Medical care was thorough. Nutrition was prioritized. Everything reinforced a single message: these children mattered more. From the moment they were born, infants were examined, documented, and categorized. Their futures were not determined by family choice, but by administrative decision. Some children were allowed to remain with their mothers under close supervision. Others were placed with families considered politically reliable, where identity, language, and loyalty could be shaped from infancy. Names were changed, origins were obscured. The state positioned itself as the ultimate guardian, quietly redefining what parenthood meant. But this was only one side of the system. As Nazi control expanded across Europe, the regime's appetite for acceptable children grew. Officials began to look beyond Germany's borders, particularly toward occupied regions. Thousands of children who fit preferred physical profiles were removed from their families. They were transported, renamed, and absorbed into German households or institutions. For these children, memory itself became a casualty. Their original identities were erased, replaced with constructed histories designed to serve ideology. Many would grow up unaware that their past had been rewritten, that family bonds had been replaced by policy. At the same time, a darker parallel structure existed for those deemed undesirable. Foreign laborers brought into Germany under coercive conditions lived under an entirely different reality. When these young women gave birth, their children were not treated as assets, but as burdens. Facilities created for them were underfunded, isolated, and deliberately neglected. Care was minimal. Oversight was absent. Survival was uncertain. These institutions were not designed to nurture life, but to manage its quiet disappearance. The contrast between the two systems revealed the regime's priorities with chilling clarity. On one side, meticulous care. On the other, calculated neglect. The difference was not circumstance. It was classification. Behind both systems stood an enormous bureaucracy. Records were kept with obsessive detail, evaluations were logged, decisions were justified through language that stripped individuals of humanity and replaced it with categories. In this framework, children became units of value, and mothers became instruments of policy rather than autonomous human beings. Publicly, propaganda concealed the reality. The program was portrayed as humanitarian, progressive, and forward-looking. Privately, It functioned as a mechanism of control that blurred the line between welfare and exploitation, between care and coercion. By embedding itself within familiar institutions, it normalized practices that would otherwise have been unthinkable. As the war intensified and resources grew scarce, the human cost of these policies became increasingly visible. Survivors carried not only physical hardship, but fractured identities. Many grew up with unanswered questions about origin and belonging. Some learned the truth only decades later, discovering that their lives had been shaped by decisions made before they could speak. For others, the loss was total. Families were never reunited. Names were never recovered. The damage extended beyond individuals, rippling outward into generations that inherited silence instead of memory. What makes this chapter especially unsettling is how ordinary it appeared at the time. There were no grand announcements, no dramatic spectacles. The system operated through paperwork, routine, and institutional language. It relied on obedience, habit, and the authority of official approval. In doing so, it transformed something deeply human into a matter of administration. The program was not an anomaly within Nazi governance. It was a logical extension of a core belief that the state had the right to define human worth. Once that principle was accepted, the consequences followed naturally. The question was never whether such power would be abused, but how far it would go. By turning birth into policy and identity into classification, the regime demonstrated how deeply authority can penetrate when left unchecked. It did not merely govern lives. It redesigned them, quietly, methodically, and with devastating effect. This history challenges the comforting assumption that such systems require overt violence to function. In reality, they often depend on structure, compliance, and the slow erosion of moral boundaries. When life itself becomes something to be managed, evaluated, and optimized, humanity is reduced to a variable. The legacy of these policies did not end with the collapse of the Third Reich. It lived on in broken families, lost identities, and unresolved questions that followed survivors throughout their lives. It remains a reminder that the most dangerous ideas are often those that present themselves as rational, orderly, and necessary. And it leaves us with an enduring warning. When power claims authority over the most intimate aspects of existence, the cost is not only counted in lives lost, but in identities erased, often long before the world notices anything is wrong. This story forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. The most destructive systems are not always the loudest. Sometimes they are the ones that operate behind reassuring language, clean facilities, and promises of progress. By turning birth into policy and identity into a category, the Nazi regime demonstrated how deeply power can penetrate when left unchecked. It did not simply govern lives, it redesigned them. History often remembers the visible instruments of domination, but it is equally shaped by quieter mechanisms that work over time, shaping belief, memory, and identity. The final question this chapter leaves us with is not only how such a system was built, but how easily it was accepted, and whether, in moments of comfort and order, we would recognize the danger if life itself once again became something to be managed rather than respected.